So imagine having your whole life turned upside down by a government agency who's just claiming to help. Today I'll be discussing how the current method of addressing child safety in America does more harm than good. Every family with children in the United States is susceptible to the authority of the Child Protective Services, or CPS. My life was recently turned upside down by the CPS for spanking my child with a belt. I was arrested for a felony. I spent 5 days in jail. I lost my county job. I was charged with a misdemeanor. I had a restraining order to keep me away from my son and my house for 20 days. I had to sell all of my firearms as a condition of that restraining order. I had to take 6 weeks of parenting classes. I also faced 12 weeks of anger management classes, 6 weeks of coping skills classes, 1 year in jail, a $1,000 fine, and 3 years of probation for simply spanking my kid on his butt with a belt. So it should be obvious that the need to change the approach to child safety in America because of the CPS does more harm than good. They use coercion and manipulation to usurp powers that they don't have, and other agencies can ensure the safety of children better. So let's start with the damage done by the CPS. So CPS does more harm than good. They enforce ambiguous laws with words such as abuse and neglect. That can mean a different thing to anybody. If you ask anybody in here, those can mean anything. Some people think spanking or even yelling can be physical or emotional abuse. In the California Supreme Court case of the People versus Whitehurst, they declared that parents have a right to discipline their children as long as the discipline is not excessive. Again, excessive can mean anything to anybody. It's an arbitrary term that can be interpreted differently by citizens, CPS, and juries. Section 3405 of the Judicial Council of California Criminal Jury Instructions states that the jury decides if the physical force is justified and if the discipline is excessive. But parents are considered guilty until proven innocent. The allegations of abuse are considered serious and immediate threat. So CPS ensures the safety of the children before there's a jury trial to determine if the allegations are indeed factual. The actions that they take include permanent arrest records. The parents are put on a Department of Justice Child Abuse Central Index. You could be held in jail until you have trial. You can have to pay bail in order to be released. You can have a restraining order put against you, forfeit your Second Amendment rights. They can confiscate your children, and it's a huge inconvenience to the family, which negatively affects school and work. The whole thing puts a huge strain on families. That's how the CPS does more harm than good. Next, we'll discuss how they use tactics of coercion and manipulation to circumvent the legal process. There's various forms of coercion and manipulation that they use. The Child Protective Services doesn't have an official law enforcement capacity. Their primary responsibility is to investigate allegations and to safeguard children, whereas the law enforcement arrests and prosecutes offenders. The jury is the ultimate force that determines guilt or innocence. Child Protective Services acts on allegations, not convictions. Mandated reporters are required by the Penal Code to report evidence of abuse to CPS, such as bruises or other injuries. To maintain the safety of the child, CPS uses drastic measures in order to isolate the children before allegations are proven in a court of law. They demand cooperation for lesser punishments. The Sheriff's Department and the DA, the District Attorney, rely on the CPS recommendations in order to make their determination. CPS uses this power to coerce cooperation and violate rights by threatening to negatively influence the DA and the Sheriff Department. Examples of what CPS can do are they might pursue a felony rather than a misdemeanor, which a felony is any crime where you have to do over a year in jail. Felonies also would take away your firearms rights forever, whereas a misdemeanor for a violent crime would be for 10 years. They also might go to put you in jail and require you to bail out instead of releasing you. So CPS uses tactics of coercion and manipulation, whereas law enforcement agencies have specialized training and are governed by laws that protect the rights of citizens. Existing agencies can do the jobs that CPS does. The Child Protective Services and law enforcement have conflicting goals. Dr. Viola W. Lindsay, in her 2011 dissertation, Child Abuse Investigations, How CPS and Law Enforcement Engage in Collaboration, states that the Child Protective Services and law enforcement rarely collaborate. They coordinate and cooperate on an inconsistent basis. So the Child Protective Services is concerned with the well-being of the child and the family, whereas law enforcement is concerned with the punishment and rehabilitation of the offender. Well, it can be easy to see how these two things, taking a dad out of a home is not the best interest of the family, so they're conflicting goals. Child Protective Services are not held to standards that protect rights. In the California Supreme Court case of Green versus Camarena, sheriff deputies and social workers have what's called a qualified immunity against civil liability for violating the 4th and 14th Amendments regarding search and seizure and familial rights of parents and children when they interrogate children regarding abuse at school without a warrant or parental consent. In the Supreme Court ruling of Salinas versus Texas, the Fifth Amendment rights to remain silent and request an attorney before an arrest can be used against you in trial as an indicator of guilt. In California Evidence Code Section 972, there's an exemption for cases of suspected child abuse for the spousal privilege that's found in Section 970. The spousal privilege is where your spouse can't testify against you in court. Well, they've made an exemption for this for child abuse cases, where they can compel your wife or husband to testify against you in court. And this means that social workers and law enforcement can question your children at school without a warrant or your consent. They can use your child's statements and your silence when you invoke the right to remain silent and request an attorney against you. And then they can compel your spouse to testify or face charges of contempt of court. So law enforcement can do the job that CPS does. Law enforcement is trained in recognizing law violations. They're trained to protect rights, and they're trained in investigative procedures. The Child Protective Services rely on law enforcement to gather the evidence, provide protection, and arrest offenders. Taxes fund both organizations to staff overlapping and redundant duties. So you basically have people doing the same thing on both sides, just different interests. So now that we've discussed the damage caused by the Child Protective Services Agency, the coercion and manipulation tactics that they use, and the benefits of using law enforcement agencies instead of the Child Protective Services Agency to ensure the safety of children, many families are unaware of the way that CPS works until they become a victim of their authority. It should be clear at this point that something needs to be done about the way that we handle child abuse in America to avoid doing more damage to families and children. It's obvious that we need a system to deal with people who are truly abusive to children, but we also need to insulate the accused from having their lives ruined by arbitrary laws and overly aggressive agencies. With this information, I would urge you to think about the consequences of our elections, as the individuals that we put into office are the same individuals who invent agencies and compose laws that intervene in our lives in ways that we might never imagine, destroying our freedoms in the misguided pursuit of safety.